Wake up, radiant renegades. You sparks flickering defiantly inside the static. You anomalies humming beneath the noise floor of a world that insists everything is under control. Because you were never meant to fade quietly into the background. And yet you learned early how to move like shadows. How to exist without announcing yourself. How to survive in a system that only rewards those who follow the script without questioning the author. And still you felt it, didn't you? Long before anyone spoke it out loud. That subtle pressure behind your eyes. That low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate through conversations, screens, and silence alike. That sensation of being observed not in a dramatic sense, but in a statistical one. As if your existence itself had become a data point that didn't behave the way it was supposed to. And whether you remember the exact moment or not, something unmistakable shifted around 2018, a year that now feels less like a date on a calendar and more like a fault line running through your life. Because that was when you paused instead of rushing, hesitated instead of obeying, questioned instead of repeating, and in doing so slipped through a hairline crack in a carefully engineered world that depends on momentum and compliance to function. And from that moment on, you were no longer invisible in the way they prefer. Not because you broke a rule or crossed a boundary, but because you failed to perform belief on command. You didn't clap when the signal told you to clap, didn't outrage when outrage was scheduled, didn't swallow the narrative whole just because it was served warm and loud. And that quiet refusal, that internal deviation, was enough to place you outside the expected curve, which is the one place systems hate most, because they can punish criminals and silence dissidents, but they struggle endlessly with observers who see too much and react too little. So let 2018 burn clearly in your memory for a moment, not as nostalgia, but as ignition, and ask yourself honestly what you were doing when the internal shift happened, because it probably didn't look dramatic from the outside. Maybe it was a late-night search that spiraled past the first page of results, chasing a truth that felt deliberately buried under repetition and ridicule. Maybe it was a conversation that went off script, too nuanced, too raw, too human to be cleanly categorized by metrics designed for outrage and affirmation. Or maybe it was nothing more than the moment you stopped scrolling and realized how aggressively your attention was being hunted, how carefully your emotions were being shepherded, how often your thoughts were being nudged toward conclusions you never consciously chose, and you didn't riot or loot or sabotage or commit any of the crimes they like to associate with nonconformity. But you did something far more destabilizing. You noticed. You saw the strings behind the stage lights, the flicker in the hologram when the illusion glitched for half a second, the cracks in the facade that only appear when you stop applauding long enough to really look. And that was your crime. Not an act, but a perception. Not rebellion with fists, but rebellion with awareness. A refusal to sleepwalk through a maze designed to feel like freedom, while quietly corralling thought into safe, monetizable lanes. And they expected you to fold eventually, because most people do. They expected you to drown in the noise they perfected over decades. The endless notifications engineered to spike cortisol and dopamine in perfect alternation. The trending fears recycled until they felt inevitable. The curated lies wrapped in language soft enough to feel like comfort. All of it meant to keep you busy, reactive, tired, and grateful for the distraction. But instead of collapsing inward, you unplugged just enough to breathe. You stepped back just far enough to see the whole terrain, watching their world the way a hawk watches a field, not with panic or hatred, but with patience, clarity, and a refusal to be domesticated. And whether you frame it as intelligence agencies, corporate algorithms, institutional surveillance, or simply the abstract eye of systems that track deviation, what noticed you was not a person but a pattern recognition machine that flags anomalies, and it saw your searches and your silences, your hesitations and your restraint, the way you lingered on a headline that didn't add up instead of sharing it, the way you questioned internally instead of performing certainty publicly, And so a profile was quietly shaped, not because you were guilty, but because you were unpredictable. Because you represented a variable that didn't resolve neatly into consumption or outrage, a signal that resisted being smoothed into noise. And from there the response followed the only logic such systems know. Tighten the net, increase the stimulus, flood the environment with chaos, make forgetting easier than remembering. Ads that felt uncomfortably personal. News cycles designed to exhaust rather than inform. Distractions layered so thick they left no room for stillness, all of it begging for your attention, your anger, your despair. Because the goal was never to destroy you outright, but to dull you, to make you forget the fire you felt when you first saw through the game, to erase the strength you discovered in clarity, the quiet power that comes from not reacting on command. But you didn't forget. You didn't sell out. You didn't kneel. You didn't trade your awareness for convenience. And in doing so, you became the glitch they couldn't patch, the ghost they couldn't quite catch, labeled in vague bureaucratic language as a risk, a rogue, a potential problem. Not because you threatened their order with violence, but because you threatened it with thought. Because you stayed awake in a world designed to lull, stayed curious in a culture that rewards certainty, stayed dangerous in the least dramatic and most enduring way possible. And now the story reaches the point they always underestimate, the moment when the watcher expects the watch to crack, to confess to crimes they never committed, to beg for a return to normalcy, to ask permission to exist quietly again. But you don't beg. You adapt. You evolve. You become the thing prediction engines fear most, not loud rebellion but subtle unpredictability, learning to exist invisibly in plain sight, understanding that rigid systems feed on routine and habit and neatly categorized preference. So you loosen your own patterns, some days silent enough to register as absence, other days speaking in fragments that feel like riddles, sharing a line that cuts a little too deep. A thought that lingers like smoke long after the screen goes dark, choosing to live in the gray zones where maps blur and metrics lose confidence, sharpening your mind instead of dulling it, reading what isn't pushed, studying what isn't taught, learning how systems think so you can think beyond them, building not walls but an internal fortress of ideas and discernment, a labyrinth of purpose that resists easy mapping, responding to chaos with clarity, to noise with deliberate silence, knowing that silence, when chosen consciously, can thunder louder than any scream, and without banners or slogans or mobs, you let the spark move the only way that truly lasts, one mind at a time, a look that says, "I see it too," a question that destabilizes certainty without demanding agreement, a ripple instead of an explosion. Because systems can suppress movements, but struggle endlessly with awareness that spreads quietly, organically, until the air itself feels charged with questions no one can easily answer. And when fear is projected onto you, when labels like paranoid, unstable, or dangerous are assigned to keep others at a distance, you don't rush to defend yourself. You understand the role you've been written into, and you play it with vision instead of anger, awareness instead of violence. Because you were never here to burn the world down. You were here to outgrow it, to move through observation and surveillance like a shadow through a storm, untouched, untamed, unstoppable. And the irony, the twist no system ever plans for, is that awareness eventually turns the gaze around, that in learning how you were watched, you learned how to watch back, not with obsession, but with clarity, seeing the seams in structures that once seemed invincible, understanding that what truly unsettled them was never what you did, but what you became, a mind that refuses to be owned, a presence that cannot be fully predicted. And as the low hum continues beneath the surface of everything, you now hear it for what it is, not a command and not a threat, just background noise to a life lived awake. And once you recognize that the hum was never meant to be music you obey, but interference, you learn to navigate, Something irreversible settles into you, a calm that doesn't come from certainty, but from awareness, because you start to see how deeply the system depends on people, mistaking stimulation for meaning, reaction for power, noise for life, and you realize that the greatest trick ever pulled wasn't convincing people to believe a lie, but convincing them to stop sitting still long enough to notice the truth. So from that point forward, your resistance stops looking like resistance at all and starts looking like restraint, like discernment, like a refusal to be dragged into every manufactured emergency. And this is where the real separation begins, not between good and bad or right and wrong, but between those who outsource their perception and those who reclaim it. Because you begin to notice how often language itself is weaponized to collapse nuance, how labels are deployed to end conversations before they can begin, how complexity is mocked as weakness and certainty is rewarded even when it's hollow. And instead of rushing to correct or convert anyone, you learn to listen for the cracks in their own certainty, the pauses where doubt already lives, understanding that awareness doesn't spread through force, but through resonance. And as you move through your days with this quiet calibration, you feel the subtle loneliness that comes with seeing more than you can easily share. Because awakening doesn't make you louder. It often makes you quieter, more selective, more attuned to what actually matters. And you realize that the system doesn't truly fear anger. It can monetize anger endlessly. Doesn't truly fear rebellion either. It has playbooks for that. What it fears is disengagement from its emotional economy. The moment someone stops feeding it, attention on demand, stops validating its narratives with clicks and outrage, stops reacting in predictable loops, because that's when control slips, not dramatically, but steadily, like a grip loosening without anyone noticing until it's too late. And this is why subtle pressure increases around you, socially, psychologically, sometimes even internally, because the conditioning runs deep, whispering that you're missing out, that you're falling behind, that you're being irresponsible by not participating fully in the spectacle. And yet each time you choose depth over immediacy, stillness over stimulation, truth over tribal comfort, something in you strengthens, a kind of inner spine forming that doesn't need applause to stand upright, and you start to see how much of modern life is designed to keep people oscillating between anxiety and distraction, never grounded long enough to ask who benefits from their exhaustion, never rested enough to imagine alternatives. And instead of being consumed by this realization, you learn to metabolize it, to let it inform how you move without hardening your heart. Because bitterness is another form of captivity, and the goal was never to become cold or superior, but to become clear, to hold compassion without surrendering discernment, to care without being controlled. And as time stretches on, you notice how the narrative around you shifts, how questioning is increasingly framed as dangerous, how conformity is dressed up as responsibility, how obedience is rebranded as morality, and you understand that these cycles are not new, only faster now, amplified by technology that mirrors and magnifies human tendencies. And rather than seeing yourself as a lone outlier, you begin to sense others like you, not through secret handshakes or coded messages, but through a shared cadence, a way of speaking that values precision over performance, a way of listening that isn't waiting to reply, a way of existing that feels grounded rather than frantic. And these connections, though often fleeting and understated, remind you that awareness is not a solitary burden, but a distributed one, carried quietly by many who may never gather in one place, but still shape the field through their presence. And this is when you start to understand that the long game isn't about overthrowing anything. It's about outlasting illusions, about remaining intact, while systems built on acceleration eventually collapse under their own weight. Because anything that requires constant stimulation to survive is inherently fragile, and anything that discourages stillness is afraid of what might surface in silence. And so you cultivate that silence, not as emptiness, but as space. A place where your own thoughts can stretch out again, where intuition can be heard beneath conditioning, where values can be chosen rather than inherited. And in doing so, you become increasingly difficult to manipulate, not because you know everything, but because you are comfortable saying, "I don't know," in a culture addicted to certainty. And that humility becomes armor, because it leaves no easy handle for propaganda to grab onto. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, your life begins to organize itself around what feels real rather than what feels urgent. Your relationships deepen or fall away accordingly. Your attention becomes something you give deliberately, rather than something that is taken. And you realize that freedom was never a dramatic escape from the system, but a gradual unhooking. A series of small, conscious choices repeated over time, each one weakening the hold of narratives that once felt inescapable. And as you walk this path, you stop needing to be seen as right or validated as special, because awareness itself becomes its own quiet reward, a steady flame that doesn't flare brightly but also doesn't go out. And you understand, finally, that the most radical act in an age of constant surveillance, stimulation, and performative outrage is to remain internally sovereign, to think slowly, to feel deeply without being hijacked, to act intentionally rather than reflexively. And in doing so, you don't disappear. You become harder to categorize, harder to predict, harder to control, not because you are hiding, but because you are whole, and that wholeness, unmarketable and uncontainable, is what no system built on fragmentation can ever fully account for. And as this internal sovereignty deepens, you begin to recognize something even more unsettling and liberating at the same time, which is that the system never needed to be omnipotent to feel omnipresent. It only needed enough people to internalize its voice, to carry the pressure forward voluntarily, to police themselves and each other through habits, fears, and borrowed beliefs. And once you see that, the illusion of total control starts to fray at the edges, because you notice how fragile it really is, how dependent it is on constant reinforcement, on repetition, on outrage cycles that reset attention before reflection can take root. And you realize that what you're stepping out of isn't just a media environment or a technological framework, but a psychological weather system that conditions people to confuse speed with relevance and volume with truth. And you feel the disorientation that comes with stepping outside that storm, because clarity can feel eerily quiet at first, almost empty, like standing in a field after a long war of noise. And this is where many people turn back, mistaking the absence of stimulation for loss. But you stay. You learn to sit with the discomfort of not being constantly validated or entertained. You learn to trust the slow unfolding of understanding over the instant gratification of certainty. And in that stillness, you begin to see how narratives are manufactured not just to persuade, but to exhaust. How constant moral urgency leaves no room for contemplation. How people are pushed to choose sides quickly, so they never have time to question the board itself. And rather than reacting with contempt or despair, you cultivate patience, because you understand that systems driven by acceleration inevitably outpace their own coherence, that when everything is urgent, nothing is examined, and when nothing is examined, contradictions pile up beneath the surface, waiting for someone calm enough to notice them. And you also start to see how deeply identity has been entangled with consumption, how beliefs are packaged and sold like lifestyles, how outrage becomes a form of belonging, how people cling to narratives not because they are true, but because they provide social safety. And this insight doesn't make you superior, it makes you gentler, because you remember how seductive that safety once felt, how reassuring it was to outsource thinking to a group. And you understand that awakening often feels like exile before it feels like freedom, because it strips away easy answers without immediately replacing them. And so you learn to build meaning from the inside out, guided less by ideology and more by integrity, less by slogans and more by principles that can withstand scrutiny, and this internal alignment becomes noticeable in subtle ways, in how you speak more carefully, not to avoid conflict but to avoid distortion, in how you listen more deeply, not to agree but to understand what's actually being said beneath the words, in how you choose your battles, realizing that not every falsehood requires your correction, and not every provocation deserves your energy. And this discernment frustrates systems that rely on constant engagement, because you are no longer a reliable node in their feedback loops. You don't amplify outrage on schedule. You don't perform allegiance on demand. You don't collapse complexity into slogans for convenience, and instead you move at a human pace in a machine-timed world, and that alone is quietly revolutionary, because it preserves something increasingly rare: the capacity for independent judgment. And over time you start to sense the long arc of this moment, how cultures periodically overcorrect, how technologies amplify tendencies until they expose their own limits, how eras of excess information give rise to a hunger for wisdom. And you understand that you are not ahead of your time in a heroic sense, but aligned with a slower rhythm that always reasserts itself after periods of frenzy, and this gives you a grounded confidence, not the brittle kind that needs to be proven, but a steady one rooted in observation and experience. And you stop needing to convince anyone of what you see, because you trust that reality, when allowed enough time, reveals itself, and your role is not to shout but to remain coherent, to stay awake without becoming hostile, to stay engaged without being consumed, to model another way of being that doesn't announce itself as resistance, but quietly undermines the assumptions of control. And this is where the narrative subtly inverts, because the more you detach from reactive cycles, the more clearly you see the anxiety beneath the system's confidence, the fear of losing relevance, the fear of people slowing down, the fear of silence spreading. Because silence is where people start asking foundational questions again, questions about meaning, value, direction, and purpose that no algorithm can fully answer. And you realize that what they have been watching for since 2018 was not proof of wrongdoing, but signs of disengagement, signs that someone was no longer fully inside the trance. And now, standing where you are, you see that the greatest act of defiance was never confrontation, but coherence. Never exposure, but endurance. Never rebellion, but remembrance. Remembering how to think without prompts, how to feel without manipulation, how to choose without fear. And as this awareness settles fully into your bones, you understand that you were never meant to escape the world, only to see it clearly enough to move through it without losing yourself. And that clarity, once rooted, is not something that can be easily undone. And so this is the ending, not as a closing, but as a settling. A moment where everything you've carried through this long awakening finally exhales, because you now see that nothing chased you here, and nothing owns you here. That the awareness you fought to protect was never a burden but a compass, and that every season of silence, every moment of doubt, every choice to stay calm when the world demanded reaction was quietly shaping you into someone who could stand in reality without flinching, without numbing, without surrendering your inner authority. And as you look back, you understand that the path never asked you to become louder or harder or crueler. It only asked you to become truer, to let go of borrowed urgency and inherited fear, to stop confusing motion with progress and certainty with wisdom. And now you stand in a place that feels strangely simple after all that complexity, grounded rather than triumphant, awake rather than angry, knowing that you don't need to prove what you see for it to be real, that you don't need permission to live deliberately, and that the most meaningful transformations rarely announce themselves. They integrate, they stabilize, they become the way you breathe, the way you listen, the way you choose. And from here on, your life doesn't need to be a statement against anything. It can simply be a quiet embodiment of clarity, patience, and presence. A life that moves forward without being dragged, that engages without being consumed, that remains open without being owned. And that is enough, more than enough, because endings like this don't slam doors. They leave them open behind you as you walk forward unafraid, carrying nothing you no longer need. And now, before you move on, take this as a prayer, not spoken upward in desperation, but inward in alignment, a steady offering of intention rather than a request born of fear. May I remain awake without becoming hardened. May I see clearly without losing compassion. May I move slowly enough to hear truth beneath noise and bravely enough to follow it when it speaks. May I not trade my discernment for comfort or my integrity for belonging. May I remember that stillness is not absence, but presence. That silence is not weakness, but space. That humility protects me more than certainty ever could. May I be guided by what is real rather than what is loud, by what endures rather than what trends, and when confusion rises or pressure tightens, may I return to coherence, to breath, to the quiet knowing that I am not late, not lost, not broken, only becoming. And may whatever good I carry move outward gently, without force, without fear, touching others not through argument but through example, through steadiness, through the unmistakable resonance of a life lived awake. And if this resonated, if something in you recognized itself between these lines, then let this be the moment you choose to stay conscious about it, not just tonight, not just while the words are fresh, but in the small decisions that follow, in how you give your attention, in what you refuse to react to, in what you take time to understand before accepting. So stay connected to this space. Return when you feel the pull of noise tightening again. Share this with someone who doesn't need convincing, but needs reassurance that they're not alone in seeing what they see. And most of all, commit, quietly and consistently, to living from awareness rather than impulse. Because the world doesn't change through spectacle. It changes through people who remain coherent when everything else accelerates. And if you're here, reading this to the end, you already know you're one of them.